I was asked to give a presentation on what can be seen from 400 to 700, 4,000 to 7,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And I took a lot of satellite pictures to a group of people who were experts, and the institution I went was a high-tech institute of the government. And blurry down, that computer wasn't working. I spent about half an hour describing my images in words rather than in visually. So I almost had a fit here, but I think it's repaired. It's working now. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am labeled, when I left science in 1972, I was, just before I left science, I was labeled as a man with soldering iron and pliers. And I wanted to get rid of that image because I wasn't a man with soldering iron and neither with the pliers. These were the tools that I used in my profession. But I was much more than that. And I almost get labeled nowadays that I am an expert on verification, which is again not true. I have an extremely broad base. Verification is a part of the whole work that one does. It's an important part, but it's not the only one. Because I've been working on non-proliferation treaty, I've been working on the outer space treaty, I've been working on conventional weapons, I've been working on chemical weapons. And also I'm proud to say that in the late 70s, when the Environmental Modification Treaty was being negotiated in the United Nations, there were two papers that were used as basis for the negotiation. One was a Canadian one, and the other one was mine. So you see, I'm just trying to blow my trumpet here to dispel this idea that I'm an expert on verification. I am a little more than that. I labeled my title of the talk this evening, Spying from Outer Space, or Managing Global Nuclear Threat and Verifying Treaties. Well, I've used deliberately the word spying because in the early days, this is how it began. The United States and the then Soviet Union developed a spacecraft to look at each other. And in fact, in the 60s, President Johnson made a statement, and that was the very first time that we knew actually that there existed spy satellites in orbits. When he said that whatever billions of dollars I spent on our space program is paid off because we have seen from satellite pictures that there is no missile gap. And that was the crux of the matter. And this is what really has been driving my efforts, that if you can see so much, why aren't we all using it? And hence in 73, when I worked at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, in Stockholm, I made a proposal that there should be this capability under the United Nations. And of course, as you probably realize, that political proposals have a gestation period of at least 7 years, if not more. So it took France to take notice of my chapter, and in 78 they made a proposal to the UN that there should be an international agency to monitor arms control and crises. Of course, the United States and the Soviet Union were opposed to it. They didn't like it. And it was killed off, and it never took off till today. That document, which with a Canadian lawyer friend of mine I wrote, and it was then subscribed by the 24 governmental experts in the UN, is lying in the dungeons of the UN somewhere in New York, gathering a lot of dust. However, in the meantime, I suggested that I understand the problem, because it's they're trying to share very sensitive information amongst hundreds of, not hundreds, 150 countries. And that is a difficult thing to handle. How do you manage that? Perhaps a good thing would be to go on a smaller scale. And I made a proposal in '84 that we should establish a European agency. Only European countries would observe Europe. And we were negotiating conventional weapons treaty, and we were negotiating confidence building measures in Europe. And it was an ideal time to propose. And it was taken up by the then Western European Union, and said, Bhupendra, we like this idea, we want to take it on. And now we've got a European agency established in Madrid. And I worked there for a year trying to train people as to how to use the information. However, that's I will touch on that again, but let's move on. Let's kind of give you a background to not only myself, but the kind of presentation I'm going to make. Now, we recently, two very important documents were presented to the international community. One is the Solana report, which was from the European Union in 2003, which identified the threats that Europe faces and also international community. And the threats were identified as terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, regional conflicts, state failures, and organized crime. And then in 2004, under Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, published another report which identified again the elements that affects international security. But this was a much broader basis. There, Kofi Annan identified poverty, infectious disease, environmental degradation, conflicts between and within states, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and transnational organized crime. So you see, UN has a much broader base. And both now, combined with the regional area, meaning Europe and international community, have common perception of security and common threats. So, we now have arrived today, as was already mentioned, that finally the governments are talking about disarming from nuclear weapons. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, because it hasn't happened so far, and we've been talking about it since many decades. But hopefully it will happen. But in order to it to happen, you really need to know that countries have really disarmed. And until that capability exists, and particularly amongst the international community, we are not going to be able to achieve a meaningful disarmament, nuclear disarmament. And this is the only driving force that's behind me to work in this area. So, one of the things that always is having a problem in verifying any kind of agreement is that countries don't like inspectors rampaging around on their land. In other words, they don't like intrusive inspections. Now, non-proliferation treaty is an intrusive inspection, and hence it suffered a lot from problems like Iraq, member of the NPT, and yet it proliferated, or it was on the verge of proliferation. It hasn't acquired any nuclear weapons, but it acquired a lot of nuclear capabilities. Now, how did that happen? Because the UN was not able to monitor effectively Iraq. And at that point in 1994, I made a proposal to the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, where I gave a presentation. And incidentally, I gave a presentation with my neck on the gallows, and I showed satellite imagery of Israel, a nuclear facility, and North Korea. And of course, during my presentation, there was a deathly silence. And then a lot of the people from the US nuclear weapons labs came to me and said, "Bhupendra, I'm glad you did it. We could never do it, but it had to be done." So I said, am I going to pay a price for that? And I went to see the Secretary General a day after my presentation, and I said, well, what happened? So he said, you have made two countries very angry. So I said, who? Well, United States and Israel. And you saw those two people leaving my office were Israeli ambassadors. So I said, isn't that a good thing? If I've annoyed somebody, then there must be some truth in it. And the country that was supporting me in my work, and by the way, it wasn't UK until that time, was Germany. And it was under the German support program for the IAEA that I made this initial study. And the Germans came to see me and said, "Bhupendra, you upset Americans, and we like it. We like to support you. Would you like to continue?" I said, "No, I know. I better get a permission from my government, because I don't want to be accused tomorrow of working for a foreign government, although it's a part of NATO and friends and so on." But nonetheless, I approached our government in Vienna, and I said, "Look, I've been offered this thing. Should I continue?" She said, "Yeah."